Many of us often think, what if I could have done things differently? Well, there are general managers currently in the NFL and throughout the decades past that have thought the same thing, and typically numerous times. We will go through some of the bigger gaffes in the history of the NFL draft with the NFL draft just days away. It's Mark, it's Izzy, it's the Pro Football History Channel, a place that we hope that you will find a frequent stop to. Izzy, how we doing tonight?
Oh man, I'm so good that we're talking about the draft. I mean, how could I not be good? How could you not be good if you're not talking about the draft? I mean, we're going to talk about pro football history, but we're going to talk about it in light of the NFL draft. And Mark, you know me, you've known me for a long time. I kind of fall into that category of people that feels like the reason the NFL season exists is so that we can get the order for the NFL draft that's coming up. Super Bowl, that might determine who's the last team to pick, but it's all so that we know we're all prepared for the NFL draft. So I'm just kind of one of those draft nuts. So tonight I wanted to take a look at history, but kind of like, Mark, I was thinking, people talk about in sci-fi movies, time travel. Is time travel possible? Can we even do that? And then you get the nerd that comes in the room. Well, actually, there's this thing called the butterfly effect, where if you go back 1,000,000 years and kill one little butterfly, then the whole history of life unfolds differently. And then you don't exist anymore. So, I will be that damp rag today, that wet towel, because I want to take a look at the NFL draft from that light, from the standpoint of, what if there were some things that happened through the years that came really close to happening significantly differently that would have changed the history books? And that's what I want to see. I want to take a look at some of those examples today.
You're reminding me of a Twilight episode that would take us back to like 1960 and recant, trying to eliminate Hitler and such things. But this isn't quite as weighty. We're going to take everyone back first to 1979 and a quarterback that you highlighted just a week ago in your quarterbacks that we need to know about. And
if you missed
Montana.
that episode, folks, on the Pro Football History Channel, go back and watch that one. We did talk about this guy. And before I begin, let me just preface this by saying, you know me, Mark. You know I'm a Green Bay Packers fan. We all have our teams we like. I try to be neutral here. But the stories today do, at one level or another, involve the Green Bay Packers only because they're the stories I know. But I want folks to take from these stories that every team probably has a closet full of these that could have changed their destiny significantly. And so the quarterback you're talking about, Mark, is Joe Montana. Joe Montana. In 1979, Joe Montana was coming out for the NFL draft, and the Green Bay Packers Midwest Scout. The scouting departments are broken up by region of the country, as you can imagine. And the Midwest Scout knew Joe Montana well because he played some college football in the Midwest. He pleaded with the guy who had all of the control of decision-making in Green Bay at that time, a guy we also touched on last time, Bart Starr. Bart Starr was the lingering head coach. He didn't have too many years probably left in him as the head coach, but he did have all power there. And Red Cochran was our Midwest scout, and he pleaded with Bart Starr in the second round to draft Joe Montana because he had seen the tape, right? And the second round comes, and instead of choosing Joe Montana, Bart Starr decided to select a running back named Steve Atkins. Now, he's coming for he's going to be in the Hall of Fame, right? Steve Atkins? No? Yeah?
Maybe via the Veterans Committee, they'll reconsider Steve Atkins.
In your vast encyclopedic knowledge, do you have any numbers for Steve Atkins?
I'm embarrassed to say that I don't recall Steve Atkins.
Well, and we could sit here all day long and say, well, this guy turned out to be a Hall of Famer and this guy didn't. And it's a crapshoot to a certain degree, right? But it's just interesting to see those instances where, like, It's the extreme, right? Steve Atkins versus Joe Montana. So they passed on him in the second round. Well, lo and behold, guess who's still on the board come the third round for the Green Bay Packers? And Red Cochran is yelling and screaming and ranting and raving. Take Joe Montana. They ended up with a defensive tackle named Charles Martin. No, that's the guy who threw.
Yes, I was going to say
Chicago
I know
quarterback on the
him.
ground. Charles Johnson, I believe was his name. Charles Johnson, defensive tackle out of Maryland. Well, Cochran, our Midwest scout, stormed out of the room because he had watched all the tape on Joe Montana. Said, I don't care what the score is in the fourth quarter. He said, Montana is going to win the game for you. He was a prophet. And how interesting it would be if Joe Montana had put on the green and yellow.
Charles Johnson, was it Michael Adkins?
Steve Atkins.
Steve Atkins. Okay, yes. But everybody passed on Joe Montana.
Everybody did, but did everybody have the guy you entrust to bring you the names from the region of the country, ranting and raving 2 rounds in a row, and you pass on him? Now, I mean, we did have, Lynn Dickey at quarterback, so, I mean, why would you really need to move on from that?
Lynn Dickey put up some prolific stats in 1983 in particular.
Did.
And what
and
is odd
that
about
season had what is still the second highest scoring Monday Night Football game ever
against the Washington Redskins. Was it not 48-47?
Yeah, I think that's the right score. Of course, I would never question your other than stats on Steve Atkins. I would not question your encyclopedic knowledge.
I am going to the Steve Atkins statistics right now, but then I want to point out quick why I think it's ironic that Bart Starr would pass on Joe Montana. And yes, Steve Atkins rushed for all of 488 yards in his career, 239 as a rookie, 216 the next year, with 2 total touchdowns in his career. But consider that Bart Starr was lowly regarded himself. That you would have maybe thought that he would have been, number one, a quarterback of championship ilk, but also a guy that was not considered to be an elite player, would have seen that value in one Joe Montana.
And also would have appreciated some of the comparisons in their skill sets as well. Accurate, smart, not a strong-armed guy. But be that as it may, Joe went on to have a pretty decent career in San Francisco, resurrecting that club that was also mired in years of obscurity as the Green Bay Packers were. But the tie-in between Green Bay and San Francisco continued 2 years later. And this is one of those, man, how would things be different if and only if? 2 years later, it wasn't even just a regional scout. The Green Bay Packers director of player personnel, Dick Korick was his name, was really high on this guy from playing football out in California named Ronnie Lott. Perhaps you've heard of him?
He played on some decent teams at USC. Yeah.
He did. Well, he spent a significant amount of time trying to convince, once again, Bart Starr to draft with their pick. I believe they had maybe the 6th pick overall, 7th. You could check that for me. But he was so desperate, he went so far as to arrange a dinner. He flew Ronnie Lott in the days leading up to the NFL draft. He flew him to Green Bay for a visit to have dinner with Bart Starr and him at the Old Town Country Club in Wisconsin, right? Just outside of Lambeau Field. And Korick's thinking, wow, this dinner went really well. I've got my guy. And Bart Starr seemed on board. Friday night, the eve of the draft, because you remember that back in those days, the draft was all on Saturday and Sunday. So Friday night, Court goes to bed thinking, I've got my guy, because Starr was on board after their nice dinner. Woke up the next morning and drove into Lambeau Field, and Bart Starr called him in the office and said, well, I've had a change of heart. Some of the offensive coordinators have convinced me to select another player from California, Rich Campbell, quarterback from Cal. That's who we're going to go with. And Lloyd Eaton was the West Coast scout for Green Bay at that time. And he was sitting next to President Bob Harlan and basically just said to him, that's a mistake. Campbell can't play. And Harlan says to him, well, why didn't you speak up and say something? And the scout said, they never listened to me anyway. So it may be a little dysfunction leads to some of these missteps along the way. But it just, it's intriguing to think if Joe Montana and Ronnie Lott both ended up in Green Bay, how much that would have made the 80s, the 1980s, be from a football history standpoint.
I'm thinking Tom Landry would own at least one more Super Bowl championship. So that's the impact that I'm seeing, that I'm feeling as well. Now Rich Campbell threw all of 68 passes in his career and had a sterling 3-9 touchdown to interception ratio in his career. Now, the one thing Ronnie Lott may have, and the other thing that Ronnie Lott may have benefited from having that scenario play out, all of his digits may still be intact.
Yeah, that's true. So, and we're not even just talking, Hall of Famers may have ended up on a different team wearing a different jersey. We're talking really some all-time greats, some Hall of Famers. Ronnie Lott's not just in the Hall of Fame. He's one of the all-time greats. Same with Joe Montana. And there were people in that war room trying to compel the decision makers to make a different decision. Now, sometimes the draft unfolds in a way that is out of the hands of anybody in the war room. Doesn't matter how loud someone speaks up. And there was a situation in the 1990 draft with your beloved Dallas Cowboys. They had just swung a big trade with Minnesota, landed a buku number of picks. In the previous year, they had drafted in the first round, the first pick overall, Troy Aikman, who then led them to a stellar 1-15 season. So if you recall, they had also then used their supplemental draft pick. The supplemental draft that goes on in the summertime for players that kind of fell through the cracks for one reason or another. Well, Dallas decided maybe this Troy Aikman guy isn't our guy. Maybe we need to have some competition for him. So they spent their first pick, which then would have translated in 1990 to the first pick overall in the supplemental draft on Steve Walsh, quarterback out of the U, right? He went to the U, right? You're the voice of college football.
Yes, and Jimmy Johnson, of course, knowing much about Steve Walsh, having coached him there.
Well, and, Jimmy Johnson, who also had his eye on some other players that he knew, having lost that first pick overall in the 1990 draft, was still sitting there with Minnesota's number 21 pick, and then their pick at the top of the second round for having that 1-15 record. So he was using that collateral, exhaustively, trying to move back up. He really wanted to get back up into the top 5 or the top 10. He really wanted to try to get Cortez Kennedy, who also played at the U, right?
Yes, he did.
Mr. Voice of college football. They coveted him, but the price was too high. So they didn't want to pay that. So they're, okay, we're not going to get up there for that. Atlanta, if you recall, had the first pick overall, traded it to the Colts, and the Colts picked a guy from my alma mater, or at least briefly, Jeff George. Also spent maybe 2 weeks at the U. before
Not one of the more cerebral quarterbacks ever, but he had talent, arm talent. Yeah, he was all over the map, but finally settled in Illinois and had some decent success there.
Well, not done yet. Dallas, who really needed defensive help in that draft, had their eyes on Baylor linebacker James Francis,
who wound up in Cincinnati.
Exactly, ended up in Cincinnati. The Cowboys had a trade in place with the team that picked right after Cincinnati. If Francis hadn't been picked by Cincinnati, Dallas would have consummated that trade and taken James Francis, and Emmitt Smith would never have gone to the Dallas Cowboys. But the butterfly effect unfolds. Cincinnati takes James Francis, and Dallas does not consummate that trade. So now they see that most of the top 15 picks have all been defensive players. They're looking at their draft board. The defensive players are all off their draft board. They have the top guy left on their draft board is Emmitt Smith, who they had rated number 4 overall. And ironically, or coincidentally, they had just traded a second and a third round pick to San Francisco for a backup running back. Flagler? Am I saying
Terrence Flagler.
Yeah. So they had just, in their minds, thought they had secured the running back position. So we don't need a running back. But when they looked at the draft board and saw the guy left at number 4 on our board is Emmitt Smith, let's go up and get him. We're at 21. There's going to be a run on running backs. So let's see. Who do we have to get ahead of? And Green Bay was sitting at they had back-to-back picks. They had numbers 19 and 20, I believe, in the draft. 18 and 19. They had numbers 18 and 19. And Dallas was looking at the Green Bay Packers saying, well, let's see. Their leading rusher was Brent Fullwood, who rushed for 821 yards. Now, they were a passing team because at that point they had the Magic Man, who had passed for 4,300 yards, 27 touchdowns, but the running game was in need of an upgrade. So they knew that Green Bay might be a team to get past. In fact, could you maybe give a stab at guessing who Green Bay's number 2 rusher was that year after Brent Fullwood?
Can you give me some type of clue, whether it be a school where he played or if he played for another NFL team?
Okay, a school, Virginia.
Played at Virginia. Because I was going to say that I knew Brent Fullwood. I wanted to jump on Brent Fullwood before you threw him out there because I knew that you were going Brent Fullwood from Auburn there. But a Virginia back, I'm not coming up with anyone.
Well, he may not be a halfback. He may not be a fullback from Virginia, but he might be a quarterback from Virginia. Don Majkowski was the second leading rusher in Green Bay that year, leading into that draft. I'm sorry that I tricked you like that. With 358 yards rushing. So Green Bay, yes, needed a running back. So Dallas said, well, we need to jump ahead of Green Bay with their 2 picks. So they did. They leapfrogged Green Bay, went to number 17, made a trade with Pittsburgh, who was looking for the tight end, and felt pretty confident that tight end Green.
Really good one. Eric Green out of Liberty.
Eric Green, yes, would fall a little bit further. So they flip-flopped spots, gave him a 3rd-round pick, and the rest is history. Green Bay, decimated by this, went with Plan B, Darrell Thompson, running back out of Minnesota. And so history is what it is. But there were a lot of little what ifs. What if they hadn't made the trade for Herschel Walker? What if Cincinnati hadn't taken Francis? What if Pittsburgh didn't feel comfortable that Green would still be there? Life would have been a lot different in the NFL. But as we know, Emmitt Smith went on to have a pretty decent career in Dallas. What, all-time leading rusher?
Yes, he is. Still atop the board.
And second only to Jerry Rice in touchdowns.
Blair Thomas was selected second. He was the first running back off the board, number 2 overall, scored all of 7 career touchdowns.
Yeah. Yeah, you think maybe they want to do that one over again, right? Draft to do-overs?
Some of the great players, though, you mentioned Cortez Kennedy, drafted 3rd to Seattle. Junior Seau was in that draft.
Junior
he was
Seau,
5th.
yeah.
Mark
Yeah,
Carrier.
in fact, there are 3 Hall of Famers in that first round. It's Kennedy, Seau, and Emmitt Smith.
Richmond Webb was a really good player, a tackle for Miami. He was selected 9th. And you mentioned James Francis, Cincinnati. Percy Snow, a Michigan State linebacker to Kansas City. Yeah, there you go. Bringing back memories.
Just to me, this is part of what makes the draft so fun and so intriguing, that so many different things can unfold so many different ways. Which reminds me, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Izzy, before we continue on your trip through what if territory, let's just remind everyone that we'd like you to take part in all of this. Leave your comments below, and what if scenarios that have impacted you the most as a fan, and also lock in to our other videos and tell people that we're talking pro football history here all the time. So invite people on in, and please subscribe.
So, as I said, this brings me to a very special day in my life. The 1996 NFL Draft, which I watched every minute of the first round, and probably I think the second round too, maybe, with one Mark Rogers, the voice of college football. And if you remember, you know, I'm trying to enjoy every moment I do, but it's all predicated upon, you know, who are my beloved Packers going to end up with. And they were on a pretty successful run during that little time period. And they held the number 27 pick overall in that 1996 NFL Draft. And a general mantra about NFL drafts is that you don't take linebackers early. That might be changing a little bit now because you need a lot of people covering bigger wide receivers and tight ends that you maybe didn't need back then. But, you know, the general thought was you don't take the linebackers too early unless they're really special. And so the Baltimore Ravens held the 26th pick, and their general manager, Ozzie Newsome, was fairly new-ish to being a general manager. So there wasn't a lot known about his tendencies. And he essentially used every minute of his 15 minutes. Back in those days, you got your 15 minutes of fame in the first round. He used every minute of that time that he was on the clock. Now, you can conjecture that perhaps he was just trying to get his brand, on TV as long as possible, or perhaps he was looking to trade that pick. Maybe he wasn't sold on the players that were there. And Green Bay had their eyes on another Miami product, a linebacker named Ray Lewis. Perhaps you've heard of him. And it got so close to the Packers' time that they actually had the agent on the phone. They had Ray Lewis on the phone, and the representative for Green Bay had Ray Lewis's name on the draft card, standing at the table at the front of the draft to hand them the card that said Ray Lewis. And Ozzie Newsome pulled the trigger, pulled the plug, let all the air out of that Green Bay war room. And in fact, the Green Bay general manager, Hall of Famer Ron Wolf, said in that moment when he saw Ray Lewis's name come across the TV, it wasn't his best moment as the Packers GM. And he said the consolation is we went on and won the Super Bowl the next year, but still, that was the one that got away for him. And can you imagine how the late 90s, early 2000s would have been different with Brett Favre, Reggie White, and Ray Lewis playing together. Maybe the Packers wouldn't have just had their one and done Super Bowl victory. Would have been a pretty intriguing team, but that's the way the cookie crumbles in the NFL draft. So
Ray Lewis won his.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Ray Lewis won his 2 Super Bowls in Baltimore. Those after the 2000 and 2012 season. And so, yes, considering how good the Packers were, playoff good throughout the 2000s, in particular, I'm remembering a back foot pass thrown by Brett Favre against Philadelphia when a 4th and 26 conversion killed the Packers. And I thought that was a tremendous Packers team that would have been a favorite in the NFC Championship game. And, of course, the 07 overtime game at home against the Giants had Ray Lewis been there.
Similar pass.
Yes.
Similar pass by far.
To the right sideline. Yeah.
Right. So, I'm not sharing these stories just because I personally rue these days as a Green Bay fan, but just because they are some personal knowledge I have that gives the picture that the NFL draft is it's more than a crapshoot. It's really just intriguing the way all the little pieces fall in a row. Some people say it's destiny. Some people say things are meant to be. I don't buy that. I just think that, a lot of goofy things happen that could have gone differently.
The top of the 96 draft, at first glance, I thought was underachieving, but the more I look at it, really not. Keyshawn Johnson was the number 1 overall pick and had an extremely productive career. Maybe not worth the number 1 overall pick, but still very productive receiver. Not an elite Hall of Fame receiver, but close to it. Kevin Hardy was a tremendous player at Jacksonville. Simeon Rice, great pass rusher, played for the Arizona Cardinals. And then we've got a Hall of Famer cropping up as Ozzie Newsome had a tremendous first round, his first go around. Not only Ray Lewis at 16, but Jonathan Ogden, a Hall of Fame tackle. At number 4. Cedric Jones, Lawrence Phillips. Of course, he got into drug issues and his NFL career was curtailed. Terry Glenn, really productive receiver, played in the Super Bowl against your Packers. And some other players
Marvin
there.
Harrison, a Hall of Fame receiver in that group.
Yes,
as well.
He comes up as well.
Number 19 to Indianapolis.
Yes. Eddie George could get some Hall of Fame votes, of course, at some point. He shows up at 14 to Houston. Walt Harris.
It's really interesting, too, to see, where the Hall of Famers come out of a particular draft. There were 3 in the first round. In the second round, there was 1 at the very end of the second round, Brian Dawkins, the safety, who went to Philadelphia. In the third round, Terrell Owens, T.O., is in the third round. And then, as I take a quick peek, that is it. Now, certainly, we have years to go, et cetera. But, lets you know that as much as people like to say it's how the Bill Belichicks of the world use their mid to late round picks, the money is up top. I mean, that's your best odds right there.
Yeah, if we would have some kind of measurement of productivity, the first round would blow the rest of the rounds away, and the top half of the first round would. But it's easy to go back and think, how do these guys make so much money when there are Hall of Famers being drafted in the second and third rounds and being passed on? But it's easy to look back and make those kind of criticisms. But I don't know, for somebody like you, I would think maybe that you would want to keep your personal selections through the years and then compare them to the experts or what actually ended up happening, to sometimes take a little pride in who you would have selected that would have turned out.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because today I was mentioning to my son, because my kids have watched the draft with me through the years, and he asked me today, he said, who do you want Green Bay to take? And I said to him, as I've looked back at like who I think is going to be good and who I'm a hack. And at this point, I don't want to say who I want them to pick, because I would be dead wrong. And I realize, it's probably good that I'm not. My dream job was always to be a GM or at least a scout. But I think that as I've looked back over those picks, I realized, yeah, maybe it's good that I don't do that for a living. And just to tie a bow on our little our first draft together there, watching, if you remember, Mark, famously for us, after the air was taken out of the room in the Green Bay war room and in your living room as well. After Ray Lewis was picked, they immediately went to a commercial break, which is the thing that you do not want to happen when your team is on the clock, right? But it's a 15-minute window, so you figure they'll go to the commercial, they'll come back, and they'll start talking about what your team needs. And if you recall, they came back and Boomer, whoever it was, says, and while we are away, the Green Bay Packers take tackle John Michaels out of USC. Okay, now moving along.
Now, I'm not seeing anybody, yes, he was famous for doing that. I'm not seeing anybody who was immediately selected after John Michaels that was just a gut punch. But about 10 picks later, you did have a nice run of Amani Toomer, Mike Allstott, Lawyer Malloy, some guys that would have been more than useful for your team.
Yeah, you would think Mike Allstott might eventually down the road get some love for the Hall of Fame as a fullback who sort of did more than just being a fullback. He might have been a nice pick there. But, all of those Purdue picks are usually going to be really good choices. So
there's just not many of them.
We like quality, not quantity, Mark.
We could do this for hours. There's no question about that. So again, we invite everybody to leave your comments down in the comment section below. We would love to see your stories and what if situations impacted you as an NFL fan. All right. We've done 3 of these now, Izzy.
3. Wow. Man, oh man, we're veterans.
We are veterans. And
we don't have to carry the water cooler anymore.
This is the core of my experience right here. This is what I think of first and foremost. All right, it's been a whole lot of fun here.
I've enjoyed all 3, but I hope there'll be 333
yes.
more to come. And looking forward to next week. Next week again, we're going to do this sort of a draft-related talk as well, because a week from Thursday is the NFL draft beginning.
All right, folks, we will catch you next time. In the meantime, please subscribe and leave your comments below. We'll see you next time.